الصهيونية المسيحية، أي جرس تقرع في أذانكم؟ وما هي العناصر المشتركة بينها وبين الحركة الصهيونية؟ أم هما وجهان لعملة واحدة؟ الصهيونية المسيحية من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. الصهيونية كلمة يسارع الذهن إلى ربطها باللوب الإسرائيلي. هي عبارة قديمة مرتبطة مباشرة بالحركة اليهودية التي سعت جاهدة لتأسيس إسرائيل على الأراضي الفلسطينية المصادرة والمحتلة، وذلك بعدما وضع صحفي يهودي نمساوي مجري يدعى ثيودور هيرتزل الحجر الأساس لظهور الصهيونية السياسية وتأسيس الحركة الصهيونية بعد انعقاد المؤتمر الصهيوني الأول في مدينة بازل السويسرية في آب أغسطس عام 1897، وانتخب فيه هيرتزل رئيساً للمنظمة الصهيونية العالمية. هيرتزل يرى أن الصهيونية هي العودة إلى الحياة اليهودية قبل أن تكون عودة إلى أرض صهيون، بينما يرى الصهاينة المعاصرون أن الصهيونية هي العودة الفعلية إلى جبل صهيون في فلسطين، فلا يسمى صهيونياً إلا من يحمل حقائبه بالفعل ويعود إلى فلسطين. وهذا ما أكدته رئيسة وزراء إسرائيل السابقة جولدا مائير حين قالت: بعد قيام دولة إسرائيل لا يمكن أن يعد صهيونياً إلا ذلك الذي يحمل حقائبه ويأتي على الفور.
Early on when I was a kid, I'd say, when I was a young senator, I'd say, if I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist.
في الأمس القريب بدأت عبارة جديدة تتردد على مسامعنا: الصهيونية المسيحية. فما المشترك بين هاتين الكلمتين؟ ومن أين أتت هذه العبارة؟ ومتى نشأت؟ ما هي أهدافها ومآربها التي تسعى جاهدة لتحقيقها؟ ما هو مدى انتشارها وتأثيرها على المواقف من الصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي خاصة والصراع القائم في الشرق الأوسط عموماً؟ الأب في كنيسة المسيح فرجينيا ووتر في بريطانيا، الدكتور ستيفان سايزر، الصهيوني المسيحي السابق ومؤلف كتاب الصهيونية المسيحية خارطة الطريق إلى هرمجدون الذي ترجم إلى اللغتين العربية والفارسية، يجيب عن تساؤلاتنا. Dr. Stephen Sizer, welcome to our show, The Inside. Actually, the first question that pops into our head is this oxymoron between Christian and Zionism, actually very contradictory, even linguistically. How do you explain that?
Christian Zionists believe that God made promises to Abraham and to the Jewish people about the land of Palestine. And so Christian Zionists today believe those promises made to Abraham apply to the Jewish people today without reading the teaching of Jesus. When we look at the New Testament, the Christian teaching of Jesus, we find that those promises apply to all people of faith who recognize God in Jesus. And so that's the basic contradiction of Christian Zionism. It applies the promises God made in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, to today, almost as if the coming of Jesus had never happened.
Mm-hmm. Now, you yourself, you were a Christian Zionist. As a former Christian Zionist, what can you tell us about this movement? Well, as a former insider, let's say.
It's a very tantalizing and addictive belief system, because at its core is the belief that the Bible is coming true, that our generation is seeing promises made thousands of years ago coming true today in the contemporary Middle East. Mm-hmm. And therefore it's very exciting to believe that God is doing something special today that he hasn't done before. The problem with that view is that when you make very specific promises, when you make very specific claims about the Bible, for example, 30 years ago, Christian leaders were speculating that the Russian Premier Gorbachev was the Antichrist because he had a birthmark on his forehead, the mark of the beast, which is mentioned in the Bible. And so we saw communism as opposed to the church. Communism was of the devil, and therefore the Bible was coming true. Well, it didn't happen. Communism faded. We needed a new figure, a demon figure, and so Saddam Hussein fulfilled that role. And many books were written about how Saddam Hussein was rebuilding Babylon and attempting to destroy Israel, just as Nebuchadnezzar had done thousands of years ago. And obviously Saddam Hussein didn't fulfill that role either. And so more recently, Christian leaders have speculated that Osama bin Laden, or now the Iranian president, Ahmadinejad, is fulfilling that role. It's a very tantalizing theology because they read the Bible, they read the newspaper, and they think the Bible's coming true.
So why did you give up being a Christian Zionist? What are the main reasons behind that?
When I visited Israel-Palestine and saw the devastating effect that this theology has on the people who live there, both Jews and Palestinians, I began to reappraise my thinking. And as I read other books and heard other speakers, particularly Palestinian Christian leaders, speaking about the Bible and how to read it correctly, I began to appreciate that what I had been taught and understood was not consistent with the Bible, but more importantly, was not showing care and compassion for the people in the Middle East. It was demonizing the Palestinians and eulogizing the Israelis, and neither warranted that.
Now, what reactions did you face in consequence to what you've done from former fellow, let's say, Christian Zionists?
Well, Zionism is very intolerant of other views, and I've found to my cost that when you begin to advocate for civil rights for the Palestinians, when you begin to challenge the theology of Christian Zionism, I've experienced a number of individuals who have made very personal attacks against me and tried to undermine my credibility, not so concerned with challenging my interpretation of the Bible, much more interested in seeking to denigrate me and take me down, as it were.
You said in your book, actually, that Christian Zionism, and according to others too, that it's even there much before Israel, and even older than, the notion is older than the United States itself. And maybe it goes back to 1649 or something. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the 15th, 16th century in Europe was quite a radical shift of thinking. You saw the power of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope begin to be challenged by nationalist movements in Europe, in Germany, France, Britain, Holland and so on, where kings and queens began to choose not to pay their taxes to Rome, chose to become independent of that religious influence. And you saw the translation of the Bible, the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, into European languages. And that allowed ordinary people to read the Bible afresh. And they began to see that the claims made by the Pope and by Rome at that time were not valid. And at the same time, there was a renewed interest in the Jewish people. As they read the Bible, they learnt about God's plan for the Jewish people. And so there was a rise of a compassion for the Jewish people, but at the same time, a realization that they wanted to help the Jews get back to the land of Palestine.
But how can you emphasize a bit on the ideological background and ideological, let's say, basis of Christian Zionism?
Well, it wasn't solely a misreading of the Bible. Clearly, the European powers, this is France and Germany and Britain particularly, as superpowers before America, had an interest in the Middle East geopolitically. They wanted to control the trade routes to India, to Africa and Asia. And therefore, Palestine was strategic. And at the time, the Ottoman Empire ruled much of the Middle East. And at various times, Britain and France were friendly toward the Ottomans and at other times opposed them. And so as Britain and France were competing with each other to control the Middle East and the North Africa coast, Napoleon became the first world ruler in 2,000 years to promise the Jews a homeland, promise them Palestine, because he wanted Jewish bankers to fund his military expeditions against Britain. Britain defeated France, and Britain assumed the role that Napoleon had sought to achieve. And then at the end of the 19th century, Britain and France were competing against Prussia, against Germany. And so the Balfour Declaration, for example, promising the Jews a homeland in Palestine, was Britain's attempt to control Palestine militarily and politically. And so in one sense, we use the Jewish people to achieve our ends.
So this is the ideological building block of Christian Zionism.
Very much so, and we see it clearly today. America's interest in the Middle East is largely linked to oil and its special relationship with Israel, and in many ways it's using the Bible and Christianity to give justification for what is essentially a colonial and political agenda.
So the term does go back to 1649.
The term Christian Zionism is first used toward the end of the 19th century, as Christians designated themselves as supporters of Zionism. Prior to that, they would have seen themselves as restorationists, believing in a Jewish restoration to the land. But therefore we would call them philo-Semitic, lovers of Jewish people, rather than of a political system that didn't really emerge until the end of the 19th century.
We will talk about the implications of this movement politically, political implications of this movement, but the people do find it very strange when you talk about Christianity and Zionism. The linkage is so difficult to understand.
I understand that, but if you understand also, people's theology tends to be very simple, very black and white, very straightforward. And we read in the Bible about the Jewish people, about Israel, thousands of years ago. Today we see the Jewish people, Israel, and people wrongly equate Israel with Israel. In the Bible, Israel was a theocracy. They believed in God. There was the temple. Worship revolved around sacrifice. Today, Israel is largely a secular state. Religion plays a role, but it's a minority position within the Jewish community.
But there are extreme religious groups in Israel.
Very definitely. You have those who believe that the Messiah will come and bring the kingdom, but you have increasingly religious Zionists who believe that they must achieve God's will politically through taking the initiative. And many of the settlers in the occupied Palestinian territories are ultra-Orthodox or religious Jews.
Now there are certain religious figures, prominent religious figures and leaders and broadcasters who stand behind prominent political personalities, and they actually have a say in the making and taking of a certain decision. And like so many well-known figures like Pat Robertson, Reverend Pat Robertson, John Hagee, Jerry Falwell, but they are also fundamental, as I told you, fundamental partners in the making and taking of decisions. Why?
Well, America is predominantly a Christian country, and therefore the American electorate is going to be more sympathetic to political leaders who express their faith. And so there is clearly a link between politicians and the church, particularly in America. And religious leaders, the ones you've mentioned, people like Pat Robertson and John Hagee and others, have discovered that there is a role for them to play, rightly or wrongly, in influencing American political opinion because they have significant influence among the Christian community. And these individuals have made very provocative statements politically and religiously, claiming that God is blessing America because America blesses and supports Israel. And again, to unthinking Christians, that makes sense. America is prosperous, it's wealthy, influential. God must be blessing America. And when religious leaders tell you it's because we support Israel, sadly many people will believe that.
We will elaborate more on this particular idea of the religious figures who stand in support of political figures in support of Israel in the United States, but we have to stop now for a short break. Short break, and we'll be back. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Dr. Saizer, we were talking before the break about some personalities and figures like Pat Robertson, John Hagee, and Jerry Falwell being behind certain prominent political figures and trying to take part in the decision making and taking political decisions, actually. And they have millions of people who support them. Now, in the current US administration, who is playing this role?
Well, every political leader in the United States depends heavily on the electorate for its funding and for its political support. And frankly, it's political suicide for any political leader to speak out against Israel in the present climate. And therefore, for example, Barack Obama, the President of the United States, has made statements recently that suggest he's campaigning to serve in the Israeli Knesset rather than in the White House in Washington. Avigdor Lieberman, the Israeli foreign minister, said recently he could have signed Obama's speeches with both hands, meaning he was very enthusiastic for what the United States leadership was saying about Israel. They outdo one another in castigating Israel's critics and defending Israel.
But is there a specific religious figure that does this thing that Pat Robertson used to do during the Reagan administration, for example?
Yes, as Jerry Falwell from about 1967 through to 2007, for 50 years, was the leading exponent of Christian Zionism. And
he has like 90 million supporters?
He had 50 million, 70 million supporters, he claimed. 200,000 church leaders were on his database. And he was the leading advocate for Israel in the United States. When he died in 2007, John Hagee seems to have taken over that role. He was the pastor to Senator John McCain, who was a presidential candidate. He competed against Hillary Clinton. And John Hagee has access to about 100 million Christians on a weekly basis. His church has over 20,000 members. So it's a very large and influential church. He said recently, the United States must join Israel in a preemptive military strike against Iran to fulfill Bible prophecy and speed the return of the Messiah. Now that's very provocative rhetoric.
And he also justifies all the massacres that were committed by the Israelis, all the massacres, including the Sabra and Shatila massacre back in 1982 and the strike against the Iraqi nuclear facility.
Yes. Because they believe that Jewish people are God's chosen people, and therefore God will bless whatever they do. It's a very bad misreading of Scripture. It's a very literalistic reading of the Bible, to take a promise God made to Abraham 4,000 years ago and apply it to today, without going through the grid of God's progressive revelation in Scripture. We believe God has progressively revealed his will. And so from the Christian perspective, we see that fulfilled in Jesus. So we read the Hebrew Scriptures in the light of what Jesus said, not the other way around.
So,
sadly, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, said most people would rather die than think, and most people do.
But do people actually, this is the point, do people actually buy what people like Falwell and others?
They do seem to, because they're promising at the same time wealth and prosperity. It's one thing to sell...
But they know that their tax money are going to
Yes,
Israel.
but it's a circle like this. You sell a theology that says God will bless you materially as long as you support Israel. And so if you believe it, you're not going to eat the golden egg. You're not going to kill it. Equally, politicians depend heavily on campaign funding. That funding will flow in their direction as long as they support Israel. If they become a critic of Israel, that campaign funding will flow to their opponents. So, as I said, it's political suicide to question what Israel's doing.
So, if beliefs go like that, that Palestine is the land of the Israelis and it's the promised land and all other communities are just thorns in the waste. So what are the prospects of so-called peace? What peace are they talking about?
Well, they spell it differently. They spell it P-I-E-C-E, a piece
it's
of land.
It's a piece of land, yes.
Rather than peace, shalom, salam. That's where our priority, our burden, is to help educate, re-educate the Christian community, to help them reread their Bible and understand that God's will is not to favor one people group against another, that God's will is that we live in peace and security, that we don't discriminate against people because of their color or because of their origins. God has created everyone and loves everyone and wants us to live in harmony with each other. So our mandate as Christians is to be peacemakers and to be ambassadors of peace in the world. And so we challenge those who oppose that, and we seek to help inform other faith communities, our Muslim friends, our Jewish friends, as to what the Bible actually says about our responsibility, and help deconstruct this heretical view of Christian Zionism.
How do you explain, sir, the continuous attempts of Judaizing Israel?
It's an attempt by elements within the Israeli society to protect and preserve their existence. The ultra-Orthodox religious Jews recognize that many Israelis are secular and many Israeli Jews marry outside the Jewish faith. And that is having, from their perspective, a detrimental effect on the future viability or security of Israel. And so we see Israel moving from being a state for Israeli citizens, Arab and Jew and expat, to increasingly one that favors Jews only. So it is becoming more extreme and more racist.
You've been to the occupied territories recently. What can you tell us about your experience and the activities on your visit?
Every time I go, I become more discouraged and more despairing, because the impact of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories is like someone gripping your throat. It's strangulating Palestinian society. We were there to help the Christian community in their bridge-building, peacemaking efforts into the Muslim world and the Israeli society, to help advocate on behalf of the church there as peacemakers. But what you see on the ground is an increasingly apartheid state. The separation barrier, the apartheid wall, that's what it means in Hebrew. Hafrada means separate. It's the same word as apartheid, is seeking to annex as much of the West Bank as possible into Israel and to force as many Palestinians out of the land as possible through home demolitions, through the building of these colonies for Jews only, these special roads which only Jewish people can use, the checkpoints which cut the lifeblood of Palestinian society, the gradual eroding of their sovereignty over the land is very discouraging, because it's leading to more violence and more hostility on both sides. And that's not the way forward.
When were you there?
I was there in March. I travel
Last
maybe
March.
once a year. Community.
Please, if I may ask one last question. We talked about Christian Zionists and we elaborated on Israeli Zionists. Do you believe that nowadays there is something like Islamic Zionists?
Well, I'm not very familiar with that term, but I am aware that...
There's no such term.
Okay.
I'm the first one to talk about the issue, but do you believe that as long as we have a Christian Zionist and an Israeli Zionist, is there an Islamic Zionist?
There are certainly Muslims in the occupied territories in Palestine and maybe in some of the surrounding countries, Jordan, for example, who check the way the wind is blowing and decide to go with the flow. They see Israel as here to stay, and you either resist it or you work with it. So I'm aware in the occupied territories of some Palestinians who work with the Israelis and believe, they may not necessarily theologize about their beliefs, but for political reasons choose to work with the Israelis. I see this as very detrimental for Palestinian society.
Can we say here that Zionism is something which is the extreme of the extreme?
I wish I could say so, but Zionism is endemic to Israeli society because it is the dominant political opinion across the political spectrum. Increasingly, Israel is equated with Zionism, and that makes it much harder for Israelis who critique Zionism to have a voice in Israeli society. But we work very closely with Israelis who are critical of Zionism because we want peace and reconciliation in the Middle East. We want Jews and Palestinians to live together, either in two states or one state with equal rights.
Reverend Dr. Stephen Sizer, thanks a million for letting us into Christchurch to do the interview. إذن لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل ومع التداعيات السياسية للصهيونية المسيحية ودائما من الداخل. إلى اللقاء.